exchange-traded funds have become one of the simplest ways Canadians invest. But when you're just getting started, the choices can feel overwhelming. VFV, VOO, XEQT, all of them sound like acronyms. And if you aren't sure what they mean or which one belongs in your portfolio, you're not alone. In this video, we are going to break down these 3 ETFs, what they are, how they differ, and which one may be the best fit depending on your goals and tax situation as a Canadian investor in 2026. Let's start with the basics. All 3 ETFs, VFV, VOO, and XEQT, are designed to give you exposure to the US and global stock markets. But they differ in structure, holdings, and tax implications, especially inside Canadian accounts like the TFSA or RRSP. So first, let's talk about VFV. VFV is a Canadian-listed ETF that tracks the S&P 500 index, the largest 500 companies in the United States. It's essentially Canada's version of a US S&P 500 fund, but traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. One of VFV's strengths is tax efficiency. Because it's a Canadian ETF holding US stocks, it avoids the US estate tax issue that can affect US ETFs held by Canadians. VFV also allows you to hold US dollar units, if you choose, which can reduce foreign exchange costs if you already have USD in your account. VFV's primary purpose is pure S&P 500 market exposure. If you believe the US remains the engine of global growth, VFV is a low-cost way to capture that. Next, let's look at VOO. VOO is a popular US-listed Vanguard ETF that also tracks the S&P 500 index. It's widely used by investors globally because of its low fee, high liquidity, and direct exposure to the same index that VFV tracks. The difference between VOO and VFV is mainly structural. VOO is listed in the US, traded in US dollars, and tends to have slightly lower management fees than VFV. However, when Canadians hold VOO in taxable accounts, there's US withholding tax on dividends that can't be recovered in a TFSA or non-registered account, a nuance that doesn't affect all Canadian-listed ETFs in the same way. In an RRSP, the withholding tax issue doesn't apply, which means VOO can be extremely tax efficient for retirement accounts. Now let's talk about XEQT. XEQT is a Canadian-listed all-equity ETF that aims to be a one-ticket global equity solution. Unlike VFV and VOO, which are purely US S&P 500 trackers, XEQT holds equities from Canada, the US, and international markets all within one fund. That means XEQT gives you global diversification without having to buy multiple ETFs. It simplifies your portfolio, one ETF, many countries and sectors. It also reinvests dividends automatically and is listed in both Canadian and US dollars. For Canadians who want broad exposure without the complication of assembling many different ETFs, XEQT can be very attractive. Now that we understand what each ETF is, the next step is thinking about the key differences that actually matter for investors. The first major difference is geographic exposure. VFV and VOO give you US stocks only. That means you're investing entirely in the American market. XEQT, on the other hand, gives you global stocks. That includes the United States, Canada, Europe, Asia, and emerging markets all within one ETF. So if you believe global diversification matters over the long run, XEQT has an advantage. But if your goal is specifically targeting US growth, then VFV or VOO accomplish that very well. The next difference to understand is tax treatment. Canadians holding US-listed ETFs like VOO and a TFSA face non-recoverable US withholding taxes on dividends. VFV, as a Canadian-listed ETF, is generally more tax-efficient inside a TFSA. However, inside an RRSP, the situation changes. In that account, withholding tax on US dividends does not apply, which makes VOO a strong option for retirement investing. XEQT's tax situation is a bit more straightforward. Because it's a Canadian fund holding global equities through underlying ETFs, some withholding tax still exists at different layers, but its structure avoids many of the more complicated cross-border tax issues Canadians sometimes run into. Another difference between these ETFs comes down to simplicity versus customization. XEQT is designed to be a one-ticket solution. You buy one ETF and automatically receive diversified global equity exposure. VFV and VOO, on the other hand, are more specialized. They give you exposure to the US market only. If you want Canadian stocks or international stocks alongside them, you would need to add additional ETFs to your portfolio. For some investors, that extra flexibility is appealing because it allows for customization. But for others, simplicity is more valuable, and that's where XEQT stands out. So the question naturally becomes, which one is actually best for a Canadian investor? There isn't a universally perfect answer, but there are some practical guidelines. If your goal is pure US market exposure and you're investing inside an RRSP, VOO can be very attractive because of its low fees and favorable tax treatment in that account. If you want US exposure, but you're investing inside a TFSA, VFV may be the more efficient choice because it avoids certain withholding tax complications. And if your priority is global diversification in one ETF, especially if you prefer simplicity and a hands-off investing approach, XEQT can be one of the easiest and most effective long-term solutions available to Canadians. The important thing to understand is that none of these ETFs are wrong. In fact, all three are solid options depending on your goals, your accounts, and your tax situation. Where many Canadian investors run into problems is choosing blindly, without understanding how these differences affect long-term returns. The best ETF isn't simply the one with the highest recent performance. It's the one that aligns with your goals, the account you're investing in, and the time horizon you're planning for. And when those pieces fit together, investing becomes much simpler. If you found this helpful, subscribe to Wealth Simplified, where we break down Canadian investing decisions clearly, calmly, and without the noise.